yes, I mean that's probably a rare example at the time where they actually got it right. They actually got it spot on of what the consequence of the Nazi-Soviet pact would be. But I don't think it was entirely as clear as that would suggest in terms of, you know, this is what's going to happen. There was still a lot of confusion. And then beyond that, I would go back to my previous point, which is that this is still, you know, the wilds of, I'm not being rude, but this is the wilds of Eastern Europe. This is the faraway place about which we know even less than we knew about Czechoslovakia. Right? So there's a kind of almost a dismissive attitude. You want to try and restrain Germany, and you're trying to do that from the perspective of London. You're trying to do that by drawing a line in the sand and wagging your finger at Hitler. But if he just goes ahead and does what he wants to do, which is what he does, he's prepared to call the West's bluff, then you've got nothing in reserve. You've got no military planning in place to actually do anything in response. You've got no political will, crucially, to actually go to war. So Britain goes to war. It declares war on Germany because of the invasion of Poland, which I think is a fundamentally honourable thing to have done. There's a lot of, you know, the controversy in Poland, which I've been sort of fielding for the last couple of weeks, promoting my latest book. You still get asked all the time, well, why didn't the British do anything? Why didn't you bomb German cities? Why didn't the French act more robustly in the Saarland? You know, that could have relieved Poland, that we could have survived. And the point is there's no military planning in place, because the British and the French rather arrogantly expected that if they wagged their finger, that Hitler would do what he was told. If they threatened war, that he would stop. But he saw the Western powers as weak, corrupt, people who were on the wrong side of history. They were washed up, they were finished. He said, when he talked to one of his adjutants, and he says, I saw those politicians, talking about Chamberlain, Daladier, I saw them at Munich. These people are worms, he said. And that's his attitude. So he was willing to do what he wanted because he thought, he gambled that the British and French would do nothing. And in that sense he was right, because they didn't have a plan B. They thought they could wag their finger and he would heed them, but he didn't. And then once that finger wagging had not been heeded, there was no plan B. And crucially, there's no political will to create a plan B either. As I said, these are places that are far off the map. They're a long way away. They're complicated. We can't pronounce the names. We don't know the difference between Latvia and Lithuania, right? And I'm not joking, because that's quite a common problem even today. So never mind how difficult it would have been in the 1930s. So you can see that there's no political will anyway. And by the way, which one's Latvia again? Which one's Lithuania? So you can see there's a whole complex of problems that just sort of enforce inaction. So in a sense, Britain and France just kind of gave up on actually acting. So they go to war, which is honourable. The really dishonourable thing would have been to say, you know, Poland's on its own. We're not going to do anything. But at least they went to war in the promise that they could restore Poland at some point in the future, which of course they couldn't do. So I think there is a sort of core of an honourable mentality in 1939, but there's no political will, there's no military will, and there's no vision about what to do about Central Europe. That's the problem.
Okay, Simon. First of all, thank you very much for your book. I used a lot of in my soon to be finished doctoral dissertation, and one very interesting story for me I found out in a book, and I published in social media, on Facebook, and a lot of discussions happened here in Lithuania. It was about Operation 5. Well-known RAF commander John Slessor, you mentioned, and that plans of bombing Soviet oil resources in Baku from Baghdad, and a lot of discussions here in Lithuania. But after that, I tried to search in Google, of course, information, even though I think John Slessor is a well-known name in those who are interested in British Air Forces. So maybe you know why that, even such an important figure, maybe I think.
Why it's not talked about?
It's not talked about even in Britain.
Well, it goes back to the same issue I was talking about. It's why we don't talk about Molotovo in Berlin. It's why we don't talk about the Sugiharos story. It doesn't fit the narrative. Right? So the idea that the British and the French would be planning to bomb the Soviet oil installations in the Caucasus I think it's in the winter of 1940, going into early 41. And the plans for Operation Pike are really quite advanced. I mean, they were waiting on the go. They had forces in place, as you'll remember from the book. Yeah. So they had Air Force in place.
I was surprised. It was advanced.
It was very advanced. It was very advanced. But I mean, crucially, this is another piece of evidence that sort of backs up my idea that actually there's a core of this is why we have to understand the period properly. There's a core of the British military and political elite that actually view Germany and the Soviet Union as allies at this point. And actually what you're doing by trying to bomb the Caucasus is to try and interrupt that supply of oil to Germany. So it's almost seen, the Soviet Union is almost seen as Berlin's, as we would put it, soft underbelly. This is a way of getting at Berlin through the back door, right? Mm-hmm. Waging war on Germany through the back door. But again, if our narrative of the period of the Nazi-Soviet pact is kind of completely blank, which it effectively is. That this is the phony war, this is when we're attacked in France, this is when we have the Battle of Britain and so on. Okay. There's no space for that. It's like a jigsaw piece that has no other jigsaw pieces to lock onto it. It just floats, and then that means it gets forgotten. It gets left out of the box. So that's the problem we have. It doesn't fit the narrative. Unless you create that narrative, which I try and do in the book, where you try and make sense, honestly and properly try and make sense of that period. You know, dispensing with all the stereotypes and all of the mythology. Unless you do that, you don't have the framework, you don't have the rest of the jigsaw to put Operation Pike into, so it just gets forgotten. Do you see? Yeah.
Thank you for the lecture. My question would touch Finnish connection. Sugihara came from Helsinki. Seemed like sort of metaphoric move.
Yeah. And
during the Winter War, some divisions, especially as far as I remember, 4th Ukrainian Division, which was crashed in the forests of frozen Finland, and journalists, first the PR campaign organized so massively by the Finnish staff, then discovered a lot of goods from Poland. This division just arrived from Polish field, tanks full of Polish cosmetics, underwear, female underwear. Just they had no time to bring that to the wives or daughters or sisters. Yeah. Full of that. And Winter War, Finnish war, was so purely Soviet aggression. Yeah. It started also because Molotovo-Ribentropo agreement. And how British opinion perceived that.
Yeah.
Still believing the Soviets are neutral after September 1939 or November 1939 in Finland.
Yeah.
Was that possible for the Soviets to show that somehow separated from the Second World War?
Well, they do. I mean, yeah, exactly. I mean, it's interesting. There's a difference, I think, between, as I said before, there's a difference between the public attitude at the time, 39-40, and then the public attitude towards the Soviet Union, and the public attitude that then develops post-41. So after 41, you have this, there's an active effort to propagate a propaganda narrative of Stalin as our best friend, Uncle Joe, pipe smoking, benign, all of that stuff. Which is why I still get elderly people saying, how dare you say that about Stalin. So that's post-41. Prior to that, it's a much more realistic policy. So there is an awareness, as I said, with Operation Pike, there is this awareness that the two are, that Berlin and Moscow are in harness together. So Stalin's profession of neutrality is taken with a pinch of salt, is not really taken very seriously. There is an effort to assist in the Winter War. Again, it's rather half-hearted because it's the same mentality as in 1939. Oh, it's a long way away, we don't know what we're doing, we can't spare the material because we might need it ourselves. There's all of this stuff clouding British opinion. But actually, the Narvik operation in Norway is part of the rationale behind Narvik, is trying to open a channel to assist in Finland. By that time, of course, Finland has fallen in March 1940, but that was part of the original planning rationale. So there is an awareness that the Soviets are acting in bad faith and are aggressive and all of that. But that awareness at the time is then lost, is then buried by the propaganda narrative after 1941. You see?
So the question over here, and then,
Roger, thank you very much. Konstantin from Deutsche Welle here. I have one remark and two questions. The remark is what you say about Hitler's attitude to Daladier and Chamberlain is very much reminiscent of one current leader, slightly to the east of the border here, Western leaders, which I'm afraid will lead to the same consequences. Alas. Questions. First one is, there is still, and we talked about it before, there is still, I think, a big psychological confusion about the trust, or lack of it, that Hitler and Stalin felt vis-à-vis each other. Because the Soviet and now the Russian narrative is that, oh, Stalin was so smart, trusted Hitler, but then why the now last Soviet echelon with raw materials rolled across the border in Brest,
and why was he surprised in 1941?
And why was he surprised in 1941? That actually also breeds this whole idea that Viktor Suvorov is developing for 40 years now, that in fact Stalin was preparing for war, because it's just that Hitler basically outsmarted him. So what was the real level of trust between the two dictators, and who was probably weaker on that? And my second question is probably about the future. As a historian who now scanned this period very sort of in great detail, what are the documents that you think would be really interesting for historians to see from the still closed Soviet archives, and probably actually from the Ukrainian NKVD KGB archives that are now been opened, and that I think create a vast sort of bulk of stuff.
Yes.
But not necessarily only that, but what do you think are the big secrets of that period that we still miss?
I think that I'll do the second one first. Obviously, the still closed archives, we sort of can't know what's there because they're still closed essentially. But I think I've said this before as well. I think Ukraine's pivot westward, however painful that is being, but the pivot westward in Ukraine does open I think a tremendous opportunity for Western scholars. Because potentially, again, I'm using that phrase, but potentially it's the soft underbelly of the Soviet archival holding. And it's all the stuff that's in Moscow. I'm presuming a lot of that would have been duplicated to Kiev. I think that is opening up, and even beyond documentary sources, that for example, Ukrainian archaeologists are now sort of digging up mass graves from the Soviet period, and that sort of thing that's going on, where prior to the pivot that might have been hushed up, might have been kept quiet at the behest of Moscow. Now it's sort of publicised. So that is, I think, a very, very significant development that I think is bound to lead to a greater understanding in the West of the realities of Soviet rule, particularly in this period. And that can only be beneficial, as I'm saying, about sort of filling these gaps that we're talking about. So not only in terms of documentary archival holdings, but also in terms of attitude, in terms of talking about history, memorialization, all of those other related sort of historical processes. That can only, I think, be beneficial. And that is, to some degree, I think, is part of the reason that Moscow is so agitated by Ukraine's pivot. It's not just raw economics or raw geostrategy, I think it's that as well. It's this whole question of the control of the historical narrative. And again, I think that is part of the reason why the Russian current sort of propaganda narrative has become very shrill and actually rather ridiculous in recent years, almost completely detached from reality. I think it's almost an effort to try and, in some way, either it's desinformatia, it's part of that process of giving out numerous narratives the same way as they did with MH17. That's confuse, muddy the waters with as many contradictory narratives as possible. Or it's just sort of desperation that they're desperately trying to regain control of the historical narrative. But it's very peculiar how the sort of the Kremlin's propaganda narratives are so detached from reality these days, which I find quite peculiar. So yeah, I think absolutely Ukraine is potentially an absolute goldmine for Western historians, and I hope it will prove to be. The second question you raised, or the first question you raised, was that the level of trust between the two. I think there is, actually. It sounds bizarre, and again, this is why we have to get away from this idea that Stalin is all-seeing and knows exactly what's going to come. In 1939, he knows exactly what's happening, and he plans it all, because he obviously doesn't. I mean, if that were the case, then he wouldn't have been surprised when he hears from countless agents, foreign powers, German defectors, I mean, all sorts of people. He hears from so many people news that this attack is coming. And he hears it weeks in advance, and of course on the night before. There's this famous example of a chap called Alfred Liskov, who was a German communist who was stationed on, or was poised on the river Prut on the Romanian frontier, and he is given his orders at whatever it is, 10 o'clock at night, to say we're going at 4 in the morning. And he swims across the Prut and surrenders himself to the Red Army. And he says, "We've just been told that they're attacking in the morning." And this message gets to Stalin. I mean, this is not news to you. I'm sure you all know the story. The news gets to Stalin, and Stalin sends word back, says, "This man is to be shot. He's a disinformer." So Stalin hears this from every quarter. So if he was so wise in 1939 that he knew what was coming, and that his policy with the Nazi-Soviet pact was a defensive one to buy himself time, all that stuff, then why was he surprised? So clearly he didn't know what was coming. So this is why we have to look for other motivations. Right? It's geostrategic, it's territorial, it's economic. He wants the territories back. He's quite happy to allow the possibility of warfare in Europe, because he can stand at the sidelines and say he's neutral and ideally benefits from the chaos that he expects will ensue. Right? So this is how I describe the Soviet mentality in 1939 going into the Nazi-Soviet pact. And to me that makes sense. To me that explains the situation adequately. And I can back it up with archival references, with secondary references and so on. So to me that makes sense. The level of trust is another matter. I think there's certainly a respect between the two, and they both spoke about each other. Actually, Hitler speaks about Stalin even after 1941 with a lot of respect. He's still talking about Stalin. He talks about him as being a beast, but he talks about him in an admiring way. Like he said at that famous scene at the end. I should have shot the officer corps like Stalin did. Do you remember that wonderful scene from the bunker? So again, there's this sort of admiration for Stalin as someone who did it. He had the country by the scruff of the neck, and he was a tough guy. And I think that goes the other way as well. So Stalin, I think, also admired Hitler as a fellow revolutionary. I mean, a revolutionary on the other side. But there certainly seems to be a respect there, which is perhaps a peculiar idea, because we're so fixed, particularly in the Western narrative, we're so fixed in the idea that these are two, almost like magnetic poles, that they're completely opposite. But no, I think actually that there's a certain degree of fellow feeling and certainly respect there between the two of them. And I think certainly, Hitler respected Stalin a great deal more than he respected the Western powers. As I said, the comment about worms. The Western powers were weak, corrupt, they were wrong side of history. Stalin had a very different view of the world from Hitler's, but I think Hitler still respected it, respected him for it as well.
So just a moment, I have a question.
Thank you very much for this really very interesting presentation. And I was wondering a little bit wanted to look a little bit into the future. And you mentioned yourself that you also get this criticism about it, trying to objectively portray to counter the Russian narrative. How many, let's say, the partnerships you can develop within the historian community, how willing they are to engage on that? And, well, okay, let's really detach this from the propaganda machines, because they obviously they have this certain political goal.
Yeah.
But do you see the segments of the historians sort of, which would be willing and eager to explore it further in the Western, but also in the Eastern Europe, and then to amplify the work you do. And the second question, again, also more provocative for ourselves. Once you're hooked to the certain narrative which is perpetuated for 80 years, how easy that would be to change this for the younger generations? Because this seems to be that it's a massive effort needed.
Yes.
So how to, and why?
Yes.
Basically, why this is important for the younger ones to know this, and because, well, this was already 100 years ago almost.
No, very good question. Both. The second one, younger generation. I think the key thing, there are two aspects here. I think the first thing is education. That we need to essentially, change our history textbooks, and we need to put this stuff into the narrative. We have, particularly in the British educational system, we have an over-focus on. There are two main subjects that everyone sort of tends to study when they're at school. One of which is Nazi Germany and the Holocaust, and the other one is Tudor England. Now we can forget about Tudor England because that's sort of not very terribly relevant, but it's quite a nice sort of heroic chapter in our British history, so that's why they study it. But I think we actually over-focus nowadays too much on Nazi German Holocaust, because it's seen as an object lesson in the collapse of democracy, what can go wrong in a liberal advanced society so quickly and so badly and so on. It teaches us lessons of sort of civic, good citizenship, about toleration and all the rest of it. So there's lots of lessons that you can learn from Nazi Germany and the Holocaust as a young person in Western Europe. But in the process, unfortunately, I think we ignore the fact that there was another totalitarian dictatorship in Europe, which was just as hideous and just as murderous. And actually, a lot of people, I fear, amongst the younger generation, and bear in mind, of course, that school teaching, I don't know how it is here, but certainly in Britain, is fundamentally a left-wing enclave. There are very few people who are politically on even the centre and the right who go into education, so it's very much a left-wing enclave.